From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
As the fall election season begins, Democratic prospects for the midterms are improving. A new Wall Street Journal poll shows Democrats leading in the so-called generic poll of voter preference for Congress, 47 to 44% over Republicans. That's a reversal from March, when Republicans were favored 46% to 41%. What's behind the changing fortunes, and can Democrats defy history and keep control of the House and Senate in the midterms this fall? Plus, how did Democrats win a special election in Alaska, of all places, a very Republican state? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot, here with my colleagues, Kyle Peterson and Mane Ukwebarua. Welcome, gents. Good to have you here. So I'm going to give you a couple of hypotheses, hardly original, but nonetheless, I think, true, Mane, and bounce them off you and see what you think. As my explanations for why the Democrats have been able to turn this, I have three possibilities to explain it. One, abortion. After the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, that really seems to have mobilized Democratic voters. Two is a somewhat of an increase in the sense of maybe inflation isn't as bad as we thought. Gas prices going down in particular, that's probably helped. And three, Donald Trump has returned to center stage in his polarizing way. And because of the Mar-a-Lago search and because Donald Trump just can't stay away. And that's helped Democrats as well, because it's helped them make this from a referendum on Joe Biden's policies to a choice election, which is really going to trust Republicans and Trump. So I've thrown a lot at you there. What do you think?
Well, I'll start with the first two, abortion and inflation. I think there's no question that the polls reflect that those are the two issues that have been dominating voters' minds, and that changes in both of those domains have shifted the momentum towards Democrats within the past few months. I mean, to start with abortion, I do think that the Dobbs ruling overturning Roe versus Wade kind of caught Republicans flat-footed just a little bit. I think Republicans had been lulled into the sense that abortion is a 50-50 issue in America. It's been that way for decades. Obviously, it's going to energize Democrats when they know that there are going to be states where restrictions are going to be increased on abortion. But it's also going to energize our own voters, and it's not necessarily going to be the biggest issue in a year like this when the economy is dominating people's thoughts. But I frankly think that once Roe was overturned, that did clarify a lot of voters' thinking on the issue. And it turns out, if you look at the recent polling, more people now say that they think abortion should be legal in all or most cases than said so a few months ago before the Supreme Court ruling. And so I think there are a lot of voters who just hadn't really thought that hard about it. It wasn't an issue they considered to be in play. But once you saw this change, they did realize they do favor a somewhat more liberal sort of abortion status quo. And Republicans haven't really managed to put forward affirmative proposals for what they would like to lock in terms of abortion law in specific states. And then on the question of inflation, I do think that it's interesting that we still do have very elevated prices. People still are feeling the pain, but we've started to see a decline in gas prices. And I think you can kind of untether gas prices from general inflation in the way that voters think about it, because gas prices are so visible. You know, you see that number every time you pull into the gas station and fill up. People have a sense that that is a unique bottleneck price, as opposed to all the other things that they're paying for, but not necessarily noticing as much. So I think it'll be interesting to see if gas prices continue to decline. Will people get the sense that inflation is sort of declining, even if we do see elevated prices and all sorts of other goods? And then just very quickly on Donald Trump, which you also mentioned, I think that your hypothesis is probably right, that sort of having Trump visible again is something that obviously is going to redound more to the benefit of Democrats than Republicans. People won't just see the election as a referendum on Biden. But I do think that that's a little messier. It's a little harder to track. And so I wouldn't quite put that on the same tier as the other two issues in terms of why momentum has swung.
On the abortion point, very clear demarcation in terms of the turnout in the special elections that have been taking place for the House before Dobbs and after Dobbs. Republicans were winning and turning out in much greater numbers and winning much bigger numbers over their 2020 performance before Dobbs, Kyle. And then when you have the races since Dobbs, the Minnesota special election for the House, Nebraska special election for the House, which they won, but more narrowly than people thought. Then a Kansas referendum where the abortion language amendment to the Constitution was blown out by an anti-abortion referendum, blown out by 60-40. And then the New York special, which they lost in Hudson County, the Hudson River Valley, rather. Republicans thought they'd win, and turnout there for Democrats way up in all of those seats. So that underscores the evidence that abortion is very significant.
Just to remind people, I mean, there's two ways you can win an election. One is by changing people's minds, either the other guy's voters or independent swing voters in the middle. And the other is by getting people who are generally on your side anyway to come to the polls, particularly people who are low propensity voters, and that includes a lot of young people. The young cohort tends to be very passionate about political issues, but if you look at the data, they don't come to the polls the way that older folks do. And so that may be part of the effect that it's having here, not that the Supreme Court's decision is changing a lot of people's minds, but that it's getting a lot of young people, young women particularly, to register to vote. There's some evidence of that in the voter roll data, and then to come to the polls on election day and cast the ballot. And the other point I would just make is I think Democrats are definitely trying to capitalize on that issue. And we talked yesterday about the referendum that is proposed in Michigan. And that's a state where it's a purple state, but if that gets on the ballot as it's probably expected to, you could have a surge of people who might not normally have come out for a November midterm election. Maybe they're presidential year voters only, but who find themselves going to the polls this time. And there's been a little bit of a snafu. There was a state board yesterday that divided on whether to put this constitutional amendment on the ballot, and it has to do with some goofy formatting on the petitions that were circulated, but that's probably going to go to the Michigan Supreme Court. And the betting is probably that it will end up on the November ballot. And so, you could end up having this surge of people going to the polls.
Democrats have been saying since the Dobbs decision that the Supreme Court majority acted politically to help Republicans on abortion. Well, that hadn't turned out to be the case. I mean, I think they were acting under the law. They were making their best judgments about the law, regardless of the political fallout. And what we've seen is that the political fallout so far very much helping Democrats. I think that charge against the Supreme Court is turning out to be wrong. Part of the reason is, as Monet, you suggested, Republicans have been caught flat-footed. But part of the reason is also that suddenly abortion politics is very real. When you had Roe v. Wade as the judicial directed law, what politicians said about abortion really didn't matter. Now it matters because states have the ability to change laws, and so who you elect really matters. And just one point about abortion and its importance in the election. In the Wall Street Journal August poll, top two issues, the economy with 16% and inflation with 11% for 27% combined on the economy. But abortion is number two with 13% saying it is the leading issue. Monet?
Yeah, I think, again, that is something that very few people would have predicted before the Dobbs decision. And even afterward, it took some time for it to rise to the top of the political conversation as an issue that most voters were saying was their top priority. But I think Democrats have frankly done a good job at basically, I think, playing a little bit to some misunderstanding about what the impact of the Dobbs ruling is. We've seen a lot of people under the impression that overturning Roe versus Wade is going to sort of lead to the elimination of abortion rights, or that Republicans were planning to pass some sort of national legislation to ban abortion. Neither of those things were true, but I think they've contributed to an atmosphere of a lot of voters generally believing that it's going to become much, much harder throughout the country, not just in very red states, to get abortions. And that has sort of led them to lean a little bit more towards the Democrats and to get involved more. But I would also say that I really don't think that abortion is necessarily a winning issue for Democrats in the way that it has played out over the past few months, and that if Republicans do manage, now that they've seen how seriously voters are taking it, to present on a state-by-state basis bills to pass reasonable restrictions on abortion, they will still find that there are pretty large majorities who are in favor of restricting abortion, say, at 15 weeks, at 18 weeks, as opposed to some of the more expansive positions that Democrats in places like Michigan are trying to take that would allow abortion up until the third trimester and sometimes even afterward. And so if Republicans want to try to stop some of these losses, they're going to have to narrow the debate from what it is now, which is basically a referendum on do you think abortion should be legal, and turn it into a more specific one about what do we think the right restrictions on abortion ought to be.
I agree with you on that, but I think it's on what Republicans need to do. But boy, that's not going to be easy. 60% of the voters in the Wall Street Journal poll say that abortion should be legal in nearly all cases. So they're going to have a job of persuasion ahead of them.